Grief sucks, and it will absolutely eat you alive if you let it. Grief is something everyone experiences at some point in their life because loss in our lives is inevitable. It's unavoidable. We lose something at some point when we are alive. And grief can be many different things. It can be the passing of family members, friends, pets, but it can also be like loss of income, losing our job, losing our health even. But I guarantee you at some point in your life, you're going to experience some sort of loss and grief along with that. But grief is so weird, right? Because we as a society, really don't know how to handle it or talk about it or anything. Some people are like, oh, it'll get better. You'll forget them and you'll move on one day. And then we have this other side that's like, suck it up, buttercup. Don't cry. That didn't do nothing. Just pull up your big girl panties and go along with it. People think it's weird if you don't cry at a funeral or whatever, but then they also think it's weird if you cry too much for months and years after the funeral. We also usually only give people a few days to grieve. Like usually there's a showing or a funeral or whatever, but after the funeral is done and you go back to work or school, our teachers and our bosses expect us to just jump right back in and perform at 100%, no issues, just totally expect us to be normal. And it's so bad, right? It's so messed up. It's so weird. So how is it that grief is something we all face in our lives, but we have no idea how to handle it appropriately? What are we supposed to do to get through it if we don't even really understand what it is in the first place? If you've been around for a while, or if you've gone through some of my past videos, you'll see that grief is something I have touched on a few different times in my channel's journey. I am a licensed mental health professional, and I do not currently provide direct services, but I did for over a decade, and most of my work was in the crisis field and trauma and grief. I find grief interesting, as weird as that might sound, and I have a big passion of talking about it and educating more. But I really wanted to make this video in particular because my cat, if you were not aware, got really sick about a week ago, and unfortunately we had to put her to sleep just last week. So I'm still pretty emotional about it, still feeling pretty raw over it, but I wanted to talk about grief and kind of process through some of those feelings, and I thought this would be a great avenue to do that, and you will understand a little bit more why at the end of this video. So let's talk about more of the science-y kind of things behind grief first, okay? I think it's really helpful to look at grief as a type of trauma. Trauma is defined as experiencing or witnessing an event so overwhelming it's difficult to cope with it. I think most people would agree that loss fits into that description, and for some reason we seem to have a better understanding or can wrap our minds around trauma more than we can grief. So I think it's really beneficial to consider grief as a type of trauma we all experience. So what happens with trauma and grief? One of the first things we tend to do is ruminate about that event. We think about what happened constantly, just over and over again in our brains. And this is a very normal thing, and honestly something that's pretty expected for a bit after that event. We haven't really accepted what's happened. Logically, we know it happened, but emotionally, we haven't really accepted whatever happened yet. So the rumination is kind of our coping skill to get through that until the emotional kind of processing starts. So totally okay if you have those ruminating thoughts for a few days, even a few weeks after what happened. And that's not really the concern or the problem. The problem is when we continue to have that kind of broken record thinking and we never move past it. But eventually it gets to a point where we have to make some sort of decision. Our brain and ourself, we have to decide, do we keep doing this? Do we keep thinking about what happened over and over and over and keep thinking about the past and reliving that trauma every single day? Because that's what happens with the ruminating and the broken record thinking is we are constantly exposing ourselves to that trauma, to that grief. So it's like reopening the wound every single time and you don't give yourself a chance to heal essentially. So it continues to feel very raw, very emotional, and like it just happened yesterday, if that makes sense. So we can keep doing that to ourselves. We can make that choice where we're just reopening that wound every single day for weeks, months, years, until the next thing you know, it's 20 years down the road and you haven't made any sort of progress regarding healing. Anytime you think about this event, you instantly cry and it feels like it just happened yesterday, even though maybe it's been 20 years since it's happened. The amount of people I have seen that have made that decision to continue the ruminating, it's honestly mind-blowing how many people have done that. And it has huge impacts on us as we go further down the road. A lot of those people can't form meaningful relationships with other people because they just feel a block from that grief. Friends will often kind of give up on that friendship because they just can't bear to hear the story again and kind of feel like an emotional support for that person all the time. Work is often impacted because we're just so hyper-focused on that ruminating that we can't complete our tasks. Oftentimes you'll see that bosses refer to those people as dramatic, and it's not really because like something bad happens at work and they start crying about it. Like the bad thing can happen at work, but they still have all this like emotional turmoil from the grief that has been unresolved, that any sort of other trigger then triggers the ruminating, if that makes sense. So it just blows up. Like I said, grief will absolutely eat you alive and ruin your life if you let it. But we have another option. We have another choice that we can make. What we can do is we can learn to make that grief a part of us, like we make it a part of our lore or our history. So let me try to give you a story about this. So last year, April 2023, I had to put my dog to sleep. Her name was Shelby, and she was absolutely my furry soulmate, and that was one of the hardest days of my life. That loss hit so hard. She was 15 and nothing big happened, just old age caught up to her. But I would say the last 2 years of her life, things really started changing and she started going downhill. In that time, she started developing doggy dementia. Some other behavior changes happened. And it was really, really hard because her personality kind of got lost, if that makes sense. And that was hard to deal with and manage. She didn't know commands anymore. She sometimes didn't know her name. She didn't know to use the bathroom outside anymore, and she would often get confused in the middle of the night and not know where she was. It took a lot of patience to get through a lot of that and to give her the care that she needed. But there were times when she did better, and those were really good days, and she was like the dog that I had for 15 years, and I never wanted those days to end because those were good days. So now it's about 1.5 years later, and that loss still very, very much sucks. It hurts, but I am able to remember those lessons she taught me that I just talked about, the patience and the kind of slowing down and enjoying things moment to moment. I don't really think about how hard the last 2 years were, and especially like her last few days. I don't think about that anymore. I think about the memories, the good memories, and those lessons that she taught me. So I've sort of integrated her into my worldview. So she's still with me. She's still very much a part of me. And I do think about her pretty frequently, but I don't cry every time I think about her. I don't go to the negative about, oh my God, she's not here. I can never hug her again, sort of thing. I instead, really cherish the time that we had and the good times that we had. Do I still have days where I really get emotional and cry a whole bunch about her not being here anymore? Absolutely, I do. But those days have gotten easier to manage, and it's easier to sort of pull myself out of those days. So I haven't forgotten about her at all, and I wouldn't even say I've moved on, if that makes sense. I've just learned to make her a part of me and a piece of my history. Like, this was a chapter of my life, and I'm very grateful for that time. I cherish the memories, and maybe I'll get lucky and those will happen for me again. So that's the choice that we have to make to get through grief. We either continue doing what we're doing and cry and be emotional and just never face those feelings head on, Or we make another choice where we recognize, yeah, this really fucking sucks, but I don't want to be here forever. How do I get past this? How do I make it a piece of me, but be able to function again? But how do we do that? How do we do this integration? I know it is so cliche to say time heals everything, but it is true. If we get some time under our belt after the trauma and the grief, it does help us look at things more logically and not so emotionally. But learning how to integrate the loss into yourself, it just takes time. Firstly, absolutely allow yourself some time to grieve and feel those big feelings. It's totally okay to cry. It's okay to miss them. It's okay to kind of think about, what did I do wrong? Did I miss something? Was there something else I could have done? Those are all normal reactions. Those are all normal thoughts that we have. And it is okay to have those things and experience those things. Those are feelings, and feelings are never wrong. Feelings are never bad. They're just feelings. So remember that, please. Remember that for everything, not just grief. Feelings are never wrong. Feelings are never invalid. Feelings are never bad. It's the feelings that impact our behavior, and it's the behavior and how we react to the feelings that is often what's problematic and what we want to change. So after you've given yourself that time to feel those big emotions, when you feel ready, then we can start processing those feelings to change the behavior that happens. And there are some exercises and activities we can do to help the processing, and that in turn helps that integration process. I'm going to be straight up with you though. You have probably heard of these things that I'm about to say, and there's a reason for that. We talk about these because we know they work. And you'll also see that these are things that you do. We don't have to talk about the trauma and the grief all the time to process it. Yes, that can be really helpful. I think it can be helpful for some people to see a therapist to process through some of this stuff, but it's not absolutely necessary for all people. I think that we kind of have this misunderstanding that you have to see a therapist, you have to talk through the things to get over it, and that's not necessarily true. What can happen is if we do healthy activities, there is a sort of processing that happens in the background, in our subconscious. So we're not aware that it's happening because we're not actively thinking about the healing, if that makes sense, but it's happening on a deeper level that we're not really aware of, but it is our brain working to process. We just aren't talking about it. We're doing something else. I hope this makes more sense as we talk about these activities. So one thing you can do is you can create a memorial or an altar to the person or the pet or whatever that you lost. When we do this, we still feel connected to that person or pet or whatever. And that's really comforting for us because physically they're not here anymore, but it feels like we can keep that connection to them and we don't forget them. So for example, just yesterday, I picked up Calliope's urn and I brought it home and I put it on a shelf next to Shelby's urn. They're nice wooden boxes that have their ashes in them. They were both cremated, and then they have framed pictures on the front of them and their names engraved on them. And then on that shelf, I put some of their favorite things too. Calliope had this catnip pickle that she's literally had since she was a kitten. So I have that on her box. I have Shelby's leash and collar on her box. And then I have their paw prints in clay with their names on them in front of the boxes too. So that's my little altar to Calliope and Shelby. And I will tell you, again, I just picked up Calliope's urn yesterday. Today is the most normal that I have felt since this happened. It's been 5 days since she took the big sleep and crossed the Rainbow Bridge. So it's still very new, but today's the first day I've been able to talk about this without crying, and that is huge, huge progress. And I think a lot of that is because now that I have her urn and her ashes back, I feel like she's sort of back in my home spiritually. She's back home where she belongs, and I feel connected to her again. And I'm very comforted knowing that she's here, that Shelby's here. They have a place in my home always, and I can see them there on the shelf. I can talk to them when I feel like it. Not even gonna lie, on holidays, I always take a few minutes to talk to them. It's not uncommon for people to go to someone's gravesite and have conversations with them, bring flowers or something else to wherever they're buried. And that's all because it helps us feel connected. So we're not fearful of forgetting them. That's a big fear that a lot of people have. And I certainly had that when Shelby passed away. And by recognizing we can still have a connection, even though they're not physically here, that helps us process again on that subconscious level. So our brain is making new pathways from like the memories of that person, making new pathways from shifting it from being sad, crying over it, making a new pathway to being less emotional and recognizing that, yes, they're not physically here, but I can still have that connection with them, and that's fine. It makes it hurt less. So it's our brain repairing itself from the trauma and the grief, essentially, when we do something like this. Another way we can get the same sort of effect is doing something in their honor or in their memory. Maybe you always went to the same coffee shop and got donuts on Saturday mornings with your grandparent, and they've passed away, but you still go to the coffee shop and get the donuts on Saturdays. And that's a way that you can remember them in a good way, and it helps that reprocessing. Maybe your parent always wanted to take a trip to Aruba and they weren't able to, but you take that trip. That's another way to honor their memory and to repair and make new pathways in your brain for that grief. I mentioned that I will often talk to Shelby, and now I will start talking to Calliope and just kind of talking about whatever's on my mind or updating them on what's going on. I find that to be really helpful for me. So talking to that person, maybe writing them a letter. I had one patient before, and she would text the number. She would text her husband with just little updates, and that was really helpful for her. Those are other ways we still feel like we're keeping that connection, even though, again, they're not physically here. All of those things, again, help that reprocessing, that subconscious healing, and help that integration process. So it happens over time as we keep repeating these activities and doing these healthy things. It helps us see that trauma, that grief, as something that happened to us, but it's something that is part of us. It is not our whole identity. It's something that happened, that sucks, but it's a part of us. We become resilient and we realize, like, yes, that absolutely hurt. It absolutely fucking sucked, but I can manage it and I can continue to live my life. That resiliency is also key too, because we are going to experience multiple losses in our life. You're going to experience grief multiple times in your lifetime. But if you have successfully grieved or healthy grieved before, when it happens again, you're still going to be really emotional. It's still really going to suck, but you have the confidence knowing I got through something like this before and I can and I will do it again. I feel like that's kind of what happened for me with Calliope. Like, yes, it absolutely sucked, and it just happened so fast. It happened over a week, and she wasn't sick at all before that. So it was different than Shelby, who, had just gotten old and kind of more expected. It was totally unexpected with Calliope, and just very, very raw, really, really sucks. But something that is comforting to me is knowing, like, Shelby's loss sucked, but I have successfully navigated through that, and I will with Calliope too. Doesn't mean I forget them, doesn't mean I have moved on. I have just made them a piece of me. As cliche and corny as it sounds to some people, that's what we have to do to get through these hard times. It would be really helpful to comment below anything that you've done to get through grief before. The activities I mentioned, those are not all the activities that you can do. There are so many out there, and I think it's really helpful to share those things. One, because it makes us feel less lonely. It's really helpful to know that other people have experienced these same feelings and have gotten through it before. And if we hear that something helped someone else, we can sort of add it to our toolbox. So if we go through something similar, we can pull that out and use that tool when we need it. Take care, y'all, and I'll see you in the next one.